Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, friends, I'm so grateful that we have the chance to be together for this episode on the Kingdoms Podcast, and really grateful to have the director for the Center of Counseling and Wellness at Calvin University, Dr. Irene Kraegel, with me today. Irene, thanks for making time.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here.
Well, me too, because in truth, I am not an expert in what we're about to talk about. And the truth is, in reading your book on mindfulness and personal awareness and being present to God, I found myself saying again and again, I have a lot to learn in this space, but I'm really grateful that we can have this conversation, because especially on the front of spiritual formation and how that can lead us into wholeness, I know you have just a ton of wisdom to share. But before I get ahead of myself, I wonder, Irene, could you give a bit of a snapshot of background to listeners with regards to what the experiences were in your life that started to really inform your personal need for and even eventual encounter with the discipline of Christian mindfulness?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It was really both professional and personal in terms of the journey to mindfulness. I'm a psychologist by training, and I've been working in a lot of different clinical spaces over the last couple decades, but most recently with college students. And college students are going through an anxious time often. There are a lot of pressures and decisions and questions that are coming up for people in that young adult phase. And so as I was in a counseling role with students, I was recognizing I needed all the tools I could get to help students through that difficult season. And mindfulness was certainly becoming trendy in the field of psychology. Mental health contexts have been drawing on mindfulness for the last couple decades in terms of decreasing anxiety and depression. So I knew professionally I needed to know about it. At the same time, I wasn't totally clear on how that would fit with my Christian faith or with the faith perspective of the institution where I work. You mentioned I work at Calvin University, and we really value helping students integrate their faith and their learning, being able to pursue their vocation and their discipline in line with God's truth. And so I needed to make sure that mindfulness was cool in terms of my own Christian faith and my desire to support students in their faith walk. So I did quite a bit of research, just knowing that many times mindfulness is presented from a Buddhist framework or integrated with spiritual perspectives that aren't related to Jesus. And so as I was looking into it, I was also recognizing that personally, I was at a point of needing a deeper practice for healing. So in my own life, I have a history of depression and have done a lot of different things around that to heal and grow, but have often felt like I needed something a bit deeper than even what psychology had to offer. And so I was curious if mindfulness could perhaps be something that God could use in my own life for healing and growth. And so I signed up for a mindfulness group on my own to try it out, and was very quickly sold in terms of the power of this practice, especially as a Christian, to be able to feel more connected to life, to people, to God, to myself. It was really a transformational experience for me early on. And that, of course, made me feel more confident and empowered to even bring it to my clients professionally, knowing that if it was helpful for me, it could also be helpful for other people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I just quickly ask on that? What do you say to people when they say, oh goodness, mindfulness, is that some sort of like Middle Eastern, East Asian, Buddhist, like who would have concerns on a faith or spiritual level about that practice? What's your typical response to those reservations?
Yeah, there are a lot of ways I tend to respond. One of them is just highlighting the difference between theology and culture. And
Mm.
Christians historically haven't been great at making that distinction. And sometimes there can be things we think we're reacting to out of theological concern. And really it's just that we're not familiar with something culturally.
Mm.
So certainly there's nothing, for example, about East Asian culture that can't be consistent with Christian faith, right? So
Mm.
of course, God is everywhere.
Right.
And so sometimes helping Christians notice what are the elements of mindfulness that they're reacting to and just kind of pausing to notice. So for example, I often do use a bell when I'm guiding mindfulness practices, and
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of your typical, East Asian kind of bell that has a little striker with it. And some occasionally, not very often, but occasionally Christians might feel a little bit nervous about that and think, is that new agey somehow? Is that kind of inviting some kind of spirit? And so I often will just pause to help people notice this is just a bell. Like there are many bells around the world that are more familiar in some contexts than others. So
Mm-hmm.
in the United States where I live, we might be more familiar with a Christmas bell or a church bell or a timer bell on my oven that lets me know when my dinner is finished. And this is just a bell that we're not as familiar with.
Yeah.
But it makes a beautiful sound. It helps us to pay attention to the moment. And so that would be one way I respond, is helping people notice that difference between theology and culture.
Yeah.
But the other thing I often encourage people to notice is that there are many, many healthy practices that God has given us that we can choose if we want to integrate with spirituality as well.
Yeah.
And that's for physical health and mental health. And so there are lots of ways we can practice good mental health that don't explicitly need to name God in order to be helpful. Of course, as Christians, when we add in an awareness of God, it can be especially powerful. So if I use a cognitive behavioral therapy approach, for example, I can learn to notice which of my thoughts are more rational and less rational, which of my thoughts are helping me move in healthier directions versus unhealthier directions. And that will be helpful for me whether or not I am a Christian. But as a Christian, I can also notice that God is eager to restore my mind, right? To kind of actively be renewing my mind. And I can notice the thoughts of God that are revealed to me through scripture and through church and through community and fellowship. And that really enlivens that practice even more. Yeah. So mindfulness is like that. It's actually really psychologically healthy for anybody to use, even with no religious or spiritual connection at all. But I find that when I add in an awareness of God's presence along with the practice, it's especially powerful because then it also becomes a spiritual discipline. Yeah. So I could talk about that for hours, but I'll leave it at that.
That's fair. Well, it's like they say, it's like singing in a choir. You could be singing a song that maybe isn't specifically a worship song, but there's a ton of really good consequences from that, of a feeling of unity and togetherness in that kind of practice. And it can be so healthy to be a part of a choir. And then that, to add that element of singing something that's worshipful to God, is just adds so much richness. So I really appreciate what you said there, especially about that differentiation between culture and theology, because there are so many good ways that God is at work in the world.
I love that example. Like a choir piece can be absolutely beautiful, whether it's even singing Christian words or not. We can still find music to be beautiful. And I sometimes use a maybe more boring example of toothbrushing, that anybody who brushes their teeth will experience benefit, but a Christian could brush their teeth with some added gratitude to God for the practice, right? For this gift of healthy teeth, for access to dentists. And so, certainly in the medical profession, we are used to pursuing these avenues of healing. And then we always have the opportunity to thank God for using these different tools of wellness for our benefit. So I think of mindfulness that way.
Excellent. You write kind of early on in your book, The Mindful Christian, you say mindful awareness provides us with the opportunity to be in our lives as something to be lived and experienced, not just something to be watched, documented, or evaluated by others. It allows us to stop living life as a performance and start living life in flow with God's Spirit. This, I read that like 3 or 4 times when I saw that, and I wondered, there's a lot of ways you could run with that, but could you unpack that quote for us, especially as it could differentiate or contrast mindfulness with some of our contemporary cultural patterns of comparison and the idols of what success, in air quotes, if you will, is, or significance. How would you unpack that quote for us?
Yeah, I'm really glad you pulled that out because that's been a really helpful concept for me in
Mm,
my own journey. One of the things I was surprised by early on as I learned mindfulness was realizing how much of the world I was experiencing through my thoughts rather than directly.
mm,
And I'm not sure I totally paid attention to that difference before. It's a difference between, seeing a sunset and thinking like, oh, that's so cool. I should put that on Instagram, or I should
mm,
tell my husband about that later. Not that either of those are wrong reactions, but that's different than being fully present to the sunset that's in
mm,
front of me to actually experience it. Even thinking about it in terms of, there can be really good positive thoughts about it, like this is beautiful, God has created this, I'm so happy I'm here. Those can be valid ways of responding to that sunset and can be helpful. But mindfulness is different in that I'm instead just practicing being present to that
mm.
sunset, having that experience directly.
Yeah.
And so that was a really radically different way for me of responding to the world, to just
Mm,
experience it. And I think it got me thinking a lot, particularly in our modern context, where so much of what we do is quickly being documented and broadcast.
mm,
It's gotten harder to just have experiences without thinking about how this will appear on
mm.
social media, or how will I have this conversation on the next podcast that I speak on, or
Yeah,
whatever it is,
yeah.
right? Just kind of thinking of like the way that we are going to present this and how it will be perceived,
Mm,
by the world of strangers that we don't even know who might necessarily see it.
yeah.
And so I've been more aware that that can have a draining effect on us to always be thinking about our experiences through that filter.
Mm,
And mindfulness gives us an opportunity to relate to God's gifts to us in a more direct way.
yeah.
One of the examples I put in my book is the experience of giving a little child a gift. And I
Yes.
remember giving my nephew when he was turning 1, this little toy, and it was an elephant that had these long ears on it, and you could pull it with a little string. And a 1-year-old isn't pausing to really evaluate and judge and interpret and analyze a gift like that. They're just interacting with it. So he just kind
Yes.
of went in and started poking it and showing it to his mom. And I remember thinking, that's mindfulness. He's having a direct experience of this
Mm,
elephant pull toy right now.
mm,
That's different than like, how will this look on Instagram?
mm.
Right? He was kind of demonstrating for us this opportunity to just directly get pulled into that gift.
Mm,
And this is the world that we've been given by God as a gift. And we have this opportunity to really interact with it
yeah.
directly. That's been really emotionally freeing for me.
Mm,
Our minds often are not a healthy, happy place. It's different for
mm.
everybody, but for many people, the mind doesn't necessarily feel like a safe place all the time.
Right.
And so to recognize that we don't have to fix that or change that or always think differently,
Mm,
but we do have this opportunity of expanding our awareness beyond our thoughts about the world into a more direct experience of,
mm,
oftentimes around our senses. What do we see? What do we hear and smell and taste and feel? Having that kind of embodied experience of the world outside of just thinking
mm,
about it or paying attention to how it will be perceived by other people.
mm. And how rich it is just to be fully present. I mean, I think of instances of people live streaming an event, say like a soccer game, and on one hand they want to be at the game in the moment with the fans, eating the food, singing the songs, cheering away, and at the same time they want to be like, look where I am, look what I'm doing. And it's actually hilarious because you can jump onto their live stream and they'll be videoing the game, and then the game will like move off screen,
Mhm.
and they'll be staying with the camera where it is focused, but they're actually watching where it goes, and then like the home team scores and they like whip the camera over and they're like, oh yeah, we scored, we did this. And you have this moment of being like, I realize you're not totally present to the game, and you're not even totally present to this live. You're kind of this weird hybrid, not healthy blend of the two, because you're
Yeah, you
not
can't do both.
exactly fully present to what's best. So,
Well, and I've often thought about that as a parent too.
mm,
There's an instinct for parents now to capture everything, take photos, take videos.
mm,
And I've really learned it's a very different emotional experience for me to take a video of my son
mm,
doing a performance versus putting the camera away and just fully being present to that
yes,
performance.
yes,
And that second one, that full presence, feeds me in a whole different way
yes,
than having a video of it that
yeah,
I may or may
absolutely.
not ever look at again, you know. But to know that I was there fully and to have that connection,
Mm,
that's a much more life-giving kind of experience.
yeah, absolutely. Well, to speak about being present and mindful and engaged with what we're doing, you write about mindful eating, actually carefully really savoring and enjoying food. And you note that the practice of that attentiveness, not just limited to food, but that attentiveness for everyday activities like exercise or music or sex or work or mowing the lawn, like you fill in the blank, is really formative. And so I wonder, could you speak to how we could cultivate that ability to savor
Yeah.
everyday gifts and how mindfulness contributes to that?
Yeah, really, mindfulness is, by definition, it's this experience of being aware of the present moment and
Mm,
doing that without judgment. That's
mm,
kind of how we define it. So it's bringing our attention as fully as possible to whatever is right in front of us
right.
in the moment. There's a classic sort of cartoon drawing that I often use on presentations, and I've seen other mindfulness teachers use it as well, where there's a person walking with their dog, and in front of them, there's a row of trees and a sun. And over the person's head, you see their thought bubble, which is full of everything except those trees and sun, right? So it's like
Mm,
music and arguments and mail and bills and presentations and all this stuff cluttering their head. And then over the dog's head, you see a picture of the trees and the sun, right? So
mm,
that we always say the dog in that picture is more mindful. They actually are seeing what is in front of them.
right.
Whereas as people, we tend to walk around with everything in our head except for what
Mm,
is right in front of us. That really changes the experience, and it keeps us from gleaning the joy
mm,
from it. Now, sometimes it can also be a protective factor of trying not to feel the unpleasantness of the
right.
moment. So I always want to be clear that mindfulness is not the practice of positive thinking, and it's not the practice of trying to feel happy and calm all the time, or even to get more relaxed. It's really the practice of being more aware to everything that's in the moment,
Yeah.
everything that is present. As Christians, we can come to that knowing that God, who is sovereign, loves us. And so
Mm,
as we expand our awareness of what's in the moment, we're opening up all this space where God can then get our attention more
mm,
effectively
yes.
about whatever's going on. So, but sometimes it feels unpleasant.
Mm,
Sometimes we become more aware of sadness or anxiety or anger, fear, whatever it is, loneliness.
mm,
Um, but it's that opening up of our awareness without judgment to go,
mm,
oh, okay, there's this emotion here.
mm,
That allows us to have more access to God's spirit then, because we're paying attention.
yes.
God is invisible, so we kind of need to expand our awareness.
Yes.
We're not living in the time of Jesus where there was a physical person in front of us speaking. We're living in a time of history where God needs us to be attentive and to pay
Yes.
attention. So all that to say, yeah, these everyday examples are oftentimes these places where when we really start to pay attention, we become surprised at what might be there. We do have an opportunity for more pleasure when we pay more attention. A
Mm,
classic mindfulness exercise that students engage in is mindful awareness of a routine activity, such as
mm,
toothbrushing. This is the
mm.
second time I brought up toothbrushing.
Hey, oral hygiene matters,
There's
so
got
I'm
to
all
be
for it.
something there. I don't know. I need to come in conjunction with a dentist. I don't know. But we use this exercise actually because it's something we often do without paying any attention to it.
Mhm.
Most of us brush our teeth twice a day, and we just, we might be walking around, we might be thinking about other things, we might even be talking to somebody or doing something. It's a completely different experience to just pay attention to the sensations. And that can actually bring a surprising amount of pleasure and curiosity and joy, just to notice, like, what does that actually feel like to be brushing my teeth? Same walking, right? To start to pay attention to the miracle of walking for those of us who are able to walk. Like, how crazy is that we can sort of balance from one foot to the other, and all these muscles work in conjunction with one another to make that happen, often without giving it a lot of thought. And same with other types of movement as well. So it's really this opportunity to fully come into our experiences. Yes, eating is a great example too. How often do we just kind of scarf down our food, not necessarily even noticing if we like it or not, right? Or like what the actual experience is. And when people begin to practice mindful eating, sometimes they have that experience of savoring it in the sense of, oh, this is actually quite delicious, or this is something I want to stay with. I've had many students also have the experience of noticing, oh, I thought I liked this food, and it turns out I don't. Like, why have I been eating this all of these years, right? Like, when I actually pay attention, this is not a positive experience. So any kind of mindful approach to an everyday activity like that, it gives us better information. It helps us know more what our actual reactions are. And then it also helps us know, how is that impacting us? Someone who normally stuffs donuts in without thinking might notice, like, oh, okay, I really enjoy that first bite. And then that second bite I enjoy. And then by the end of that third donut, I actually feel sick. Like, like, interesting, right?
Who would have thought? Yeah.
Who would have thought?
Yeah.
I think this can be a really powerful thing with media, right? So we know that many of the types of media that we engage with can actually bring joy initially. But if that first 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 20 minutes of a video game or social media scrolling are enjoyable, by the time you get to hour 1, 2, 3, 17, chances are
yes,
it's no longer having a positive effect, right? But we need something like mindfulness to notice what is the actual impact, the actual effect of these different activities, and how then would we like to use that information to make wise choices about what we're engaging with.
Yeah, absolutely. Irene, you touch on prayer in your book, and I know for many people, sometimes myself included, prayer can be a frustrating pursuit. It's easy sometimes to get bored or distracted, or feel like you run out of things to say. I'm an extrovert, so I usually don't run out of things to say, but sometimes I just go off on tangents that are necessary. But you share some real wisdom about the reality that gratitude and curiosity can really enrich our prayer lives. And so I wonder, could you speak to that specifically for those who are saying, I value what you've said about mindfulness. I see how prayer could maybe really be a key part of a practice like that. How would you encourage them to embrace gratitude and curiosity and enriching their daily rhythms of prayer?
Yeah, I think that prayer is relationship. And so there are lots of different ways that people relate to each other. And in some ways, those are the templates we often use to relate to God. It's what we know in terms of relationships. So we know that talking to one another is a way of relating, sharing ideas, reacting, responding. We also know that in long-term intimate relationships where people have built trust over a long time and kind of a sense of home together, one of the most powerful things about those relationships is a sense of presence. I've been married to my husband for 22 years. I know that he'll put up with a lot. I mean, we've been through a lot together in 22 years. And I know that there's a sense of home there where whether we're talking or not, he's still my husband, right? This is a home that we've created together that's stable and solid. And it's not based on proving ourselves to each other. It's based on just a presence with each other. And so if we're quiet, that's all right. And so that is one of those templates we can bring to our relationship with God too, recognizing God is stable. God is here all the time. God's not going anywhere. And for those of us who are creating a life with a goal of being at home in God, then there is this opportunity just to be with God.
Right.
Even to be silent with God, just as we might with people that we really care about too. As an introvert, I know that, I can talk for a long time at times, and there are other times I'm like, I got nothing to say. And I
Mm,
often feel that way with God, right? Like,
yeah.
I don't know God. Like, you know more about this than I do. What do you need to hear from me? Right? Like, and so I think prayer has always been an area for me where I was like, I'm not totally sure what to do with that. I don't really have this strong impulse to say stuff to God. But I know I really love God, and I
Mm,
really like long for God's presence.
mm,
And so mindfulness and prayer have really merged for me in a lot of ways because of that. I
right.
find that when I pay attention to what God has made, to God's creation, that is really something that does awaken inside of me some awe, some
Mm,
gratitude.
mm,
It brings me into greater awareness of God being with me. And just like, my husband, where I know we can just be quiet together and grateful for one another,
mm,
there's that relationship then in that quality of the relationship with God, where there's an opportunity just to notice, oh, God's here. How cool. Like, there's
yeah.
just a stability, a
Yeah.
depth to that. And because I can easily get caught up in all my thinking about the world, I mean, the world's a mess, right? Like, I mean,
To say the least.
it's getting worse every year, it kind of seems like. So there's, we're not, clearly human beings on their own are not
Mm,
capable of just fixing all of these things that we're struggling with. So when I get caught up in thinking about that, it's not necessarily healing or helpful, or even motivating for me.
mm,
But when I can notice that God is bigger than all of
mm,
that, that
mm,
God's keeping this whole planet spinning, and that God is present in each moment, that is something that really does bring wholeness and healing
yeah.
for me, and helps me be more engaged then in the world
Right.
in ways besides just retreating
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
avoiding.
The other day I was just going out to my car in the parking lot, and a maple tree nearby was shedding a lot of the little, I don't know what the proper botanical term for this, but like helicopter seeds where they're like it
Yeah.
flicks, and there was like hundreds of them, and it was just so beautiful. And a friend had been reminding me recently about how, all the information for a towering tree is in that one little seed, and it piques your curiosity, and it inspires wonder. And as you said, it's one of those ways in which I found myself praying in response, because I was so grateful to God for this beautiful, unscripted, irreplaceable moment. So thank you for what you've said in pointing us towards those rhythms of gratitude and curiosity. I wonder, to pivot a little bit with you, Irene, you have a lot of courage in sharing in your writing about some real personal experiences of suffering and loss.
Mhm.
And while no one's story is identical, there's so many listeners, I think, who can really relate to that. And probably some listeners who wouldn't really want to buy into this healthy practice of Christian mindfulness unless they can see how it makes a difference in their pain, how it makes a difference in their suffering. And so you write that pain multiplied with resistance equals suffering, and then go on to write, in the process of resisting pain, we try to understand and analyze it. Which, and aside, I do this a ton. I've had so many repeat conversations in my brain about conflict or disappointment or regret. So in the process of resisting pain, we try to understand it and we analyze it. This keeps us connected to negative thoughts as we pull up past examples and project future examples of pain, perhaps blaming ourselves or others for everything that could have been done differently. And because of this negative looping of the mind, which happens largely unaware, we remain stuck until the cycle can be interrupted. So I speak for myself, and I think for other listeners when I say I would love to have some practical tools for breaking out of that cycle of those negative thoughts of, I can't believe that she said that to me, or I can't believe that he was irresponsible and dropped the ball on that, or I just can't believe, and how are we going to, and those patterns of overanalyzing. So could you give us maybe some practical examples of how to break free from that unhealthy cycle of really pain that ends up leading to a magnification of resistance that leads to suffering?
Yeah. Yeah, and the word resistance here is used slightly uniquely in the world of mindfulness. We're really noticing any way that we are pushing away from that direct experience.
Mm-hmm.
So when that was a really lovely list of examples that you just gave that I can relate with, like those ways that we sort of obsess about other people's behavior or what others did or didn't do. That's it's never in our control, right? It's certainly anything that happened in the past is completely out of our control. Nobody's going back. And so it's done.
Yeah.
Certainly we can't control things in the future, and certainly we can't control other people.
Right.
But even if we know that, there can be these ways that we're resisting the emotion around that. So the emotion might be grief, or it might be anger, or whatever it is. Those aren't comfortable emotions for us. And so oftentimes we are thinking about them as a way of resisting a direct experience. Right. So I'm often surprised to notice that if I'm experiencing, for example, sort of a sad or depressed or lonely feeling, it usually takes me a while to notice how much I'm overthinking that. The thought stream can naturally look something like, why do I feel this way? I shouldn't feel this way. I'm a psychologist. I wrote a book about mindfulness. Get it together, Irene. Right? Right. So this sort of like beating myself up for having the emotion, trying to understand, like, well, maybe it's because my parents did such and such, or maybe it's because of this circumstance or this person. And none of that really gets me in any different place, but it's sort of our mind's attempt to shield us from just having the feeling. It's much different. It's a whole different experience to say, let me be present to myself in this moment right now. Like, what am I feeling right now? And one of my favorite ways to get at that is to notice, what am I feeling in my body? Where do I feel this emotion in my body right now? And perhaps it's always been like this for humans, but I think certainly in a lot of modern contexts, there's a tendency to live neck up, just to kind of be lost up here in the space behind our eyes where our thoughts are swimming and swirling. And, it just sort of feels like this tangle in there. And we lose touch with this whole part of us that's neck down, like the whole rest of our physical experience gets lost as we're swirling in those questions and analyses and interpretations, predictions and memories, all of those places that our mind goes. So the question can become, what do I feel in my body? Let me get out of my head into my body. And so there are some specific mindfulness techniques that help with that. One of the classic mindfulness practices is called the body scan. And we practice going through each part of our body, just paying attention to it. It can feel a little silly initially because we do things like, what are the sensations in the big toe on your left foot? Initially people might be like, who cares? Like, why are you asking me that, right? But it's actually quite remarkable to practice getting our attention out of our heads into our bodies and just noticing what does come up there. What are the sensations on the bottom of my feet? What are the sensations on the tips of my fingers? What are the sensations at the top of my head? What does it feel like to be held by gravity? Right now, right? Like, what does it feel like to be in a chair or to be standing on a floor? And so that can be one of the ways, whether it's a full body scan practice, which is kind of a formal guided practice, or whether it's just any point during the day saying, what do I feel in my body? Let me be curious about that. That's one of the ways to start to live differently than just resisting our experience and our emotion, and to be more accepting of whatever is present. We can do the same thing with our thoughts. Like, let me just notice, what are my thoughts? And again, without judgment, without needing to force them to be different, but just paying attention to what is going through my mind. I've had seasons where there's maybe a particular circumstance or relationship or trigger that's been particularly painful. And so to take some time to just notice, my mind just went back to that same thought I've been having over and over for the last 3 weeks. How interesting, right? And so that's kind of the attitude that we're bringing with mindfulness. We're just being curious. We're noticing this architecture of our mind, noticing how this thought is related to that thought, which is holding up this thought, and then even getting curious about which thought leads to which physical sensation. Most of us have certain thoughts that immediately raise our heart rate, right? And then there can be a particular emotion that comes along with that as well. So getting curious about that, just like we might study any part of God's creation, to notice, oh, how fascinating that my thoughts and my feelings and my physical sensations are connected in this particular way.
Right.
But we're expanding our awareness to the whole body, to even kind of physically what's around us in a space, so that we're not just feeling quite as stuck in the same ruts of thinking over and over.
Right. Man, so much for good internal awareness that is tied in with that. I wonder, Irene, you continued a few pages after the last quote that I shared, and started to introduce this concept of God's resurrection work, which is a phrase I enjoy a lot. But you write, God does not always take away our suffering, our unpleasant emotions, our despair, our fear, but instead, God enters into them and does resurrection work right there in the darkness, sometimes even in secret. If I'm really honest with you, and I think if some of our listeners were honest, that quote is beautiful and maddening, because we question at times in pain if God is working. And if he is, we want to know and see explicitly how it's happening. I know for myself, there's been seasons where I found myself saying, it's almost impossible for me to really believe that God is accomplishing a resurrection work in me, that even in the suffering, God can do something redemptive and good. And so I wonder, could you unpack what that gift of resurrection work that God is faithfully working in the midst of our suffering, and even sometimes in ways as we commit ourselves to practices like these, but can't necessarily point to an explicit or concrete reality that we can say, the suffering is gone or everything has changed for the better. How would you help us understand that gift of resurrection work?
I think in my own life, a lot of that realization came from grief journeys. And so you mentioned the stories of loss that come up in the book. And one of the things we know about grief is that there's no way through it except through it. Like, you can't go around it. There's not an option to skip grief when it happens. And it gets stirred up in all kinds of ways. I mean, I know for many of us, processing some recent mass shootings, for example, that have happened, and hearing about war around the world, there are just many ways that even those stories of others' grief can be deeply triggering for our own feelings of grief too. And we don't get to skip that. We don't get to avoid feelings of grief. And so I know, as I started to practice mindfulness, I found pretty quickly that to be fully present to my emotions, whether it was grief or other uncomfortable emotions, was pretty uncomfortable. And my impulse was to try to get away from it. The image that, I think partially because of my own experiences walking with others through loss as well, and experiencing hospice ministry and care. Hospice was often the metaphor that came to my mind while I started practicing mindfulness, because when somebody is passing from this life to the next, one of the least helpful things to do is to resist that and to be like, no, 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 no. I remember being with a dear friend of mine who was in his late 80s, and he knew he had about a month to live. And I remember someone else was visiting, saying like, you're going to be just fine, Bob. You're going to be just fine. You'll be back out in that field working soon. And he was sort of like, no, like, no, it wasn't helpful for him to have somebody else saying like, you're not dying, because he was. And so the most powerful ways I've seen people react to one another through that time of transition have been just to show up fully, right? To be fully present, and to be like, I am fully here.
Yes.
Through this end of your life, through these hours, these days, these weeks, whatever this is. There's something so powerful and so beautiful about that. And I learned in mindfulness practice that I had to show up for my own feelings in that same way, not to be like, you're fine, Irene, it's going to be fine. Just pull it together. You'll feel better soon. That just wasn't that helpful. It didn't make me feel better.
Right.
But to say like, ooh, this is hard. All right, let's be fully present to whatever this emotion is. That was where resurrection was happening, right? And then when I look at scripture to see these stories of Jesus walking through death with folks,
Mm-hmm.
as part of resurrection. Certainly, Jesus' resurrection is the ultimate example of that. Of, the disciples were actually super confused,
Mm.
went and hid, even though Jesus had said, "I will rise again." They just panicked, right? And that was exactly when the resurrection was happening. It was happening in the dark when the
Mm-hmm.
disciples were hiding out. And so, they were kind of risked missing the whole thing because they
Mm-hmm.
had tuned out. But I think mindfulness is this invitation for us to stay present in the darkness, stay present
Mm.
in those, valleys of the shadow of death,
Mm-hmm.
trusting that God is doing resurrection
Yeah.
there. Lazarus is the other example, right? So,
Yes.
Mary and Martha were like, "Where were you? Like, my brother wouldn't have died if you had been here."
Yeah.
But God had this whole resurrection thing going on already, right? This
Mm.
whole plan already. So, we don't need to. I think the more we run from the darkness and run from those emotions that scare us and run
Mm.
from having those direct experiences of the world, the more at risk we are of missing the whole miracle,
Mm.
of not noticing
Mm.
resurrection, not
Yeah.
noticing the ways that God is enlivening us.
Mm.
And we always, as soon as we notice we're doing that, we always have this moment where we can be like, "Oh, like, I've been trying not to feel this sadness or this anger or this grief or this fear. Like, what if I turned right now that I've noticed this? What
Mm-hmm.
if I lay down my resistance and turn towards that emotion and am in it? Let me be in that emotion for a little
Mm.
bit. And then just be curious about where God takes that.
Mm. Mm.
Not like I have to then feel happy and resurrected,
Mm.
but more that, I can be present to it, knowing that as long as I'm paying attention, resurrection is in the works, and I'll see it eventually.
Yeah. Yes. I was thinking I so appreciate that. It brings to mind a memory from actually the other week when I was partway through your book. And as I went to bed, I was just wanting to pray through some things from that day and from that week that were, I knew, significant. And there was something that had happened that was pretty painful for me. And I did what, well, you shouldn't do, in that I kind of was like, "Oh, it's not that big a deal. Like, move past it, like, get over it. Like, you'll be fine. Just like stop thinking about it and fall asleep." And then I was like, "No, Irene says in her book, like, be present to these things." So I stopped and I thought, I'm going to be present to this emotion. Like, what really am I feeling? And almost right away, I had this sense of, you're devastated
Mhm.
that this has happened. But then it led to an opportunity to invite God into that and say, "Lord, I really feel devastated over this event. Would you be present with me in this? I know you are. Help me to be attentive to how you're present with me in this.
Mhm.
And would you journey with me in this?"
Mhm.
And it was quite edifying, and it led to a lot of peace, that
Yeah.
when you're falling asleep, you want your mind to slow down and hit pause so you can. So thank
Yeah.
you for sharing that, because I know personally that it can be very
Mhm.
practical.
Yeah, that's a
Um,
really beautiful example. And I think,
mm,
it makes me think too, in our relationships with people, that's what helps us feel close to people, is when we're real with each other.
yeah.
We've all had that experience of wanting to be present for someone else who's saying, "I'm fine. I'm
Mm.
fine. How are you?" Right? Like that kind of response
Like,
where,
no, but I
like,
really want to know, how are you
yeah,
really?
like
Yeah.
that. So often, if we're the person asking, it's because we're looking for some vulnerability that will allow us not just to support, but to feel that closeness.
Right.
And, kind of saying the "I'm fine" response can often be a wall in
Mm.
relationships. It can be a way of keeping, us from one another. And so when we do that with ourselves and with God, it's the same thing, like to tell
Mm.
ourselves, "I'm fine,"
Mm.
or not to share with God, right? For you to be able to turn to God and say, "I feel devastated."
Mm.
That I can imagine that just softens God's heart when we do that, for God to be like, "Thank you so much for opening up to me," right? Like,
Yeah.
God is so eager to be close to us in those moments. And he's there holding the healing that we long for if we're willing to be vulnerable in that moment. But we have to start by acknowledging to ourselves that we're hurting, and that
Mm.
can sometimes be the scariest part.
Yes. Well, on that note, that readiness to be honest in a healthy way with ourselves and compassionate in that, is such a vital practice to be growing in. And I wonder, oftentimes when we enter the space of the topic of compassion or self-care, people think about, I'm going to have a day at the spa, or I'm going to do my favorite recreational activity, or I'm going to eat a tub of my go-to flavor of ice cream, which there's a place for those things. But could you speak to self-compassion specifically from a mindfulness perspective, and specifically what it means for us and how it informs our ability to respond with faithful compassion to the needs of those around us?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I do believe deeply in ice cream as a key component of a self-compassion plan. But in a large,
What's your go-to ice cream?
oh man, ice cream is my favorite food. I'm so glad you asked.
Same.
Yeah, it's amazing. Here in Michigan, we're all about the Mackinac Island fudge. Is that a
Ooh.
thing beyond Michigan? I don't know.
There's fudge ice cream in Canada. I don't know if we
Okay.
have Mackinac Island. I'm a
Well,
cookie dough guy
Mackinac Island
myself.
fudge it's pretty amazing. So yeah,
Next time I'm in Michigan.
yeah, I invite you to try it. It's delicious. But yes, beyond ice cream, the idea of self-compassion is that we expand our understanding of compassion for others, expand the circle of compassion that we have for others to include ourselves. And recognizing there's not this dichotomy of either I'm kind to myself or I'm kind to you. You know, really, God's grace is actually for all. God actually loves us all. And the hardest way for us to accept that can sometimes be when it comes to ourselves. Most of us are better at extending grace towards others most of the time. If somebody's hurting, if there's a child who's crying or a friend who's had a major disappointment, most of us will respond with a hug and like, I'm sorry you're having a hard time. Towards ourselves, it can be a different story, right? Like if we're the ones crying or we're the ones with a major disappointment, the talk can sound a lot more like, what's wrong with me? Get it together. I never should have tried that. Nobody else thought I would succeed anyway. Now I proved them right. And we all have our favorite ways of beating ourselves up, but you know, there's a tendency for us to be harder on ourselves than on anybody else. And so self-compassion is an invitation for us to treat ourselves like a friend, like we would a friend, to treat ourselves with kindness, recognizing that our pain and our failures are common parts of the human experience. That when we struggle, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with us. It means that life is hard. Like we're struggling because life is hard. Every human being on the face of the planet struggles, and it looks different for each person. Each of us have different types of challenges, but no one is immune from suffering. And so we actually have opportunity in moments of pain or disappointment or failure. We have an opportunity to see that as a connection with others, which is what we actually are longing for in life, is connection with others and with God as well. So rather than pulling into our shell because we're hurt, like looking around and saying, oh, it's okay that I'm struggling because others are as well. And so self-compassion gives us permission to have a hard time. And in some ways, I think this is what was so different about the initial stages of the pandemic was, you know, in my line of work, working with people sometimes who have really high anxiety. Interestingly, we noticed quite a few clients had less anxiety as the pandemic got underway, because suddenly the whole world was describing anxiety, right? Like the whole world was like, these are challenging times. And so there was something really freeing about that, to be like, it's okay to struggle. Everybody's struggling. And so that was a really helpful kind of global phenomenon for some to say, I'm not alone in this situation. And so I'm hoping that even, you know, as we continue to move through the pandemic and hopefully out at some point, I'm hoping that that can be a takeaway for us to recognize there's a lot of power in saying it's okay to struggle. And there's a connection that can happen between all of us during times of challenge. And that's a lot of self-compassion, but also just learning to actively speak kindly to ourselves. To treat, sometimes a question really can be, what would I say to a friend who's in this same situation or who's having this same emotion? That can often give us some good clues about how we might speak to ourselves. And also just noticing, is there any opportunity in this moment to take care of myself?
Mm,
Usually if we're having an emotion that's uncomfortable or an experience, we can go into fixing it,
hmm,
which doesn't usually fix it. I mean, occasionally there are times just to fix something, but like if your toaster breaks, then you can just fix it. Great. But emotions don't tend to be very clear cut in terms of being
mm,
fixed, right?
mm,
So more often we're going to find more relief by saying, oh, I'm having this emotion that's difficult. How could I take care of myself?
hmm,
And like you said, that doesn't have to be a day at the spa. It can be sometimes, like
mm,
that can be great. But more of what we need more than ever is just that kind of throughout each day ways of caring for ourselves. And as I work with a team of therapists, and we talk a lot about those moments in between sessions
hmm.
where maybe you've wrapped up with one client and your next client's in the waiting room. So what do you do with that 5 minutes, right?
Right.
That's crucial for well-being for a therapist to notice what is it I need
Mm,
beyond a quick run to the bathroom, right? But like,
mm,
do I need to do a little bit of deep breathing? Do I need to pray for the person I just met with? Do I need to invite God into the space as I prepare for the next one? Do I need to stretch?
mm,
Right? Like, has my body gotten all like from sitting here
mm,
for the
mm.
last hour? Maybe I need to stand up and stretch. Maybe I need to loop around the building. There's no one answer, but the key is just noticing, where am I and what do I need in
Mm,
this moment? And those are the types of self-care practices we can just do throughout the day. Throughout the
right.
day, do I need a little music on? Do I need to adjust something physically? Is the temperature? Do I need food? I'm always
Mm,
trying to get college students to eat food on a regular schedule,
yes.
right? Or let's talk about sleep, right? Like, maybe,
Mm,
maybe you need some sleep, because we know that things like sleeping and eating and movement, these are basic self-care
right.
strategies that have a huge impact on our
Mm,
wellness and our mental health. So those can all be part of the picture of self-compassion. And then,
mm,
yes, also notice, when do you want to throw in a spa day or a vacation or a concert, or those bigger things. But really the things that will make the biggest
mm,
difference are those small things throughout the day, just as we
mm,
pay attention to
mm.
what we need.
I'm not a counselor and I'm not on your counseling team, but I like the idea of not only that 5 minute window and checking in with ourselves, but I think I'd probably just aim for a half pint of ice cream in those sessions. That might be my go-to.
That, yeah, if you need to just shovel the ice cream in between,
Real
that
quick.
too. Yeah, real quick.
Definitely. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So you have such wise things to say, Irene. I'm grateful. And yeah, as we maybe reach the end of our conversation together, I know for some people listening, they'll be saying, okay, this sounds so helpful, so practical, so good for self-awareness, emotional wholeness, mental wellness, being attentive to God, his presence in my life, savoring the good things he gives. And so I wonder, with this last question, you could speak to how those rhythms actually then empower us to cultivate a deeper experience of an understanding of the kingdom of God and really our role in what God is doing restoratively in the world.
I love that you're asking about rhythms, because I think
Hmm,
that's really key. One of the things that is offered through mindfulness is being able to do some formal practices, and we haven't talked a lot about what those are, but those are in the book and easy to find online too. Of a whole set of formal mindfulness practices that, when they become part of our rhythm, they can be really powerful in regrounding us.
hmm,
So those are things like the body scan I referenced earlier. There are sitting practices where we're just practicing meditative stances of paying attention to what's in my body, what are my thoughts, what are my emotions, what is my breathing like.
hmm,
There are movement practices. So there's a walking meditation, and there are different stretching kind of yoga practices. And there are loving kindness practices, which have to do with that self-compassion focus. So
hmm,
these are all sort of standardized mindfulness practices. And when we incorporate those, I think of those kind of like the workout at the gym, where we're taking time, we're setting it aside to really work this muscle of our
hmm,
attention, to
hmm,
strengthen it. And then we also have informal mindfulness practices. And this is
hmm.
more just kind of throughout the day at any point, paying attention to what's in the moment.
Right.
Most of us find that we need the formal practices to really be able to receive benefit from the informal
Hmm,
mindful awareness. And so, having those times to set aside and sit down for the formal practice, that really teaches us what it's like to pay attention, even if it's a struggle, just like those workouts at the gym. It can be a struggle, but we know that they benefit us because we're really setting time aside to increase that strength and that skill. That allows us then informally to apply mindfulness through the whole day. When we do those kinds of practices, formally and informally, we are increasing our ability to pay attention. And we can't see God's kingdom at work unless we pay attention. There's just no way around that. I mean, once in a blue moon, God will drop a lightning bolt really to get our attention. Even then, honestly, we kind of miss it sometimes, right?
Yes,
because we've already, it's like, oh, cool lightning bolt, and we've moved on to the next thing. And especially if there's some kind of positivity that falls in our path, we just don't notice it most of the time. Our brains really are tuned to pick up on the negative and to notice the negative more, and then to rehash the negative more often in our minds. So if something positive happens, we either don't notice it, or if we do, we move on pretty quickly. We don't tend to stay awake at night thinking about those positive things, right? We tend to stay awake at night thinking about those negative things. So I think this is where mindfulness gives us an opportunity to experience God's kingdom differently. God often describes his kingdom in the Bible with small things, right? It's like the mustard seed and like the pearl, all these little things, like the one, he talks about like going to find the one lost sheep that wandered off, not the big group of sheep. Like he's often kind of helping us notice where's the small thing. God seems to really care about the small things. And he wants us to notice that, like, it's these seeds that grow into these bigger things. And so we need to be able to see all these little pieces. So when we practice paying attention, we are more ready to notice God's kingdom at work.
How it's, his new life and goodness and glory are exploding all around us.
Exactly.
Irene, you have shared so much wisdom in this time together, and I'm super grateful to you, and would love for those who are listening to be able to engage with you and where you're at online or any social media platforms that you're on. And so could you let us know where people can learn more about that, and also where they can pick up a copy of your book?
Yeah, so I do try to make quite a few resources available to people. There are a lot of free mindfulness guides that I've recorded that are on you can link to them through my website, which is themindfulchristian.com is the name of the website. There are also a lot of resources there in terms of reading some of the integrative frameworks for faith and mindfulness, and being able to even explore other people's work as it might relate to Christian faith and this present moment awareness. So I would encourage people to check that out. I am on Instagram a bit at Mindful Christian, although Instagram only allows a certain number of letters. So Christian is X-I-A-N. So Mindful Christian, X-I-A-N. And so I am less and less in the social media space as I seek to be more mindful in my life.
Totally fair.
But I do kind of populate that from time to time with things going on. And yes, I did write a book called The Mindful Christian, came out in 2020, which is available wherever fine books are sold. If people want to go a little bit deeper into some of these concepts, and that's a good place to start. There's a new book coming out in August for teenagers. It's a devotional book. And so 150 devotions that start with a scripture, have a reflection, and then have a mindfulness practice included as well. Like most things for teenagers, I think it's also good for adults. I find that the principles in there will be helpful for, I think, teens and above. So that will be out in August as well. So yeah, thanks for asking.
Right on. Well, thank you. And thank you for the good resources you're developing and releasing into the world for people to engage with and learn from. But this has been a really rich time. So Irene, thank you so much for everything you've shared today and for being on the podcast.
It's been a treat. I really appreciate the opportunity.